The iron wheels of the Pennsylvania Railroad car screeched against the tracks, each metallic shriek marking another mile between Clara Evans and everything she had ever known. She pressed her face against the cold window glass, watching the endless Montana prairie stretch before her like a vast, unforgiving sea of brown grass and distant mountains. October 1886 had painted the landscape in shades of amber and rust, but Clara saw only the gray of uncertainty. Her fingers clutched the worn envelope containing Mr. Samuel Dawson's letters, 3 brief missives that had promised her a new life as his wife. The advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper had been simple. Respectable rancher seeks virtuous woman for matrimony. Must be willing to relocate to Montana territory. Clara had responded out of desperation, not romance. 23 years of scrubbing floors in other people's homes had left her hands raw and her spirit nearly broken. "Mail-order bride," whispered a woman 2 rows behind her, the words cutting through the rhythmic clatter of the train. "Can you imagine? Selling yourself to a stranger." Clara pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, pretending not to hear. She had grown accustomed to such remarks during the 5-day journey. In Chicago, a gentleman had offered her money, assuming she was a different sort of woman entirely. In Bismarck, mothers had pulled their daughters close when she passed, as if her circumstances might be contagious. The train lurched to a stop at Cold Creek Station, a wooden platform that seemed to materialize from nowhere amidst the wilderness. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her single carpet bag, everything she owned condensed into one small vessel. The wind hit her immediately, sharp and merciless, carrying the scent of sage and something wild she couldn't name. Cold Creek was less a town and more a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the elements. The main street was nothing but packed dirt, and dust devils danced between the storefronts like restless spirits. Men in worn leather and denim stopped their conversations to stare as she descended from the train, their eyes tracking her modest brown dress and Eastern bonnet with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. The Dawson family waited near a mud-splattered wagon. Samuel Dawson stood with his parents and 2 younger brothers, all dressed in their Sunday best. Clara's stomach dropped. Samuel looked nothing like the photograph he had sent. Older, harder, with cold eyes that swept over her with the calculating gaze of a man appraising livestock. "Miss Evans." His voice held no warmth. "Mr. Dawson." Clara attempted a smile, though her lips trembled. Samuel's mother, a severe woman with iron-gray hair, circled Clara like a vulture. "She's plainer than you said. Samuel, look at that dress, store-bought and cheap, and her hands." She grabbed Clara's wrist, turning her palm upward to reveal the calluses. "Already ruined. She's done servant work." "Mother's right," Samuel said, his initial assessment complete. "This won't do. You misrepresented yourself. Miss Evans, your letters suggested a woman of some refinement." Clara's cheeks burned. "I never claimed to be anything other than honest and hard-working. We have a reputation to maintain in this town." "Mrs. Dawson interrupted. "We can't have Samuel marrying some Eastern charity case. What would people say?" The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, some laughing openly. Clara heard fragments of their mockery. "Should have known better. Desperate women. Mail-order embarrassment." "But I've come all this way," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You sent the train fare. We had an agreement." Samuel shrugged. "Consider the fare a charitable donation. You're free to make your own way now." The Dawsons climbed into their wagon and drove away, leaving Clara standing alone on the platform with her carpetbag at her feet. The crowd began to disperse, though not without parting shots. "Maybe the saloon's hiring," one woman said to her companion, loud enough for Clara to hear. "They always need that sort." Clara's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Not here, not in front of these people. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. She had 43 cents to her name and no prospects in a town that had already judged her. Old Martha, who ran the boarding house at the edge of town, took pity on her. The woman's face was weathered as boot leather, but her eyes held a glimmer of kindness. "Got a space under the back stairs," she said. "It ain't much, more of a closet than a room, but it's dry. You can stay tonight while you figure things out." The space was indeed little more than a closet, with a narrow cot and a single hook for clothes. Clara sat on the thin mattress, finally allowing the tears to fall. Outside, she could hear the town settling into evening, the distant piano from the saloon, the lowing of cattle, the whistle of wind through the gaps in the walls. She must have dozed, because she woke to find moonlight streaming through a crack in the door and something warm draped over her shoulders. A man's coat, wool, well worn but clean, smelling of wood smoke and pine. Clara sat up, confused. The door was slightly ajar, and she caught a glimpse of a broad-shouldered figure walking away in the darkness. In the morning, she found more than just the coat. On the doorstep sat a cloth bundle containing fresh bread, dried meat, and a small jar of milk still warm from the goat. No note, no explanation. Martha, when asked, claimed ignorance with a peculiar smile. "Though if I had to guess," the old woman said, pouring Clara a cup of bitter coffee, "I'd say you caught the eye of Jonas Whitlow. Lives up on the mountain, that one. Doesn't come to town but once a month for supplies. Strange fellow, hasn't spoken more than 10 words to anyone in the 6 years since his wife ran off with that traveling merchant." Clara fingered the wool coat. It was finer than anything she owned, with carved wooden buttons and careful mending at the elbows. Why would a stranger show such kindness when the rest of the town had shown only scorn? She was pondering this when the door to the boarding house opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the man himself. Jonas Whitlow stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a giant of a man with shoulders that seemed to fill the frame. His face was weathered but not unkind, with deep-set hazel eyes that held shadows of their own. He looked at Clara for a long moment, then placed a small leather pouch on the table and left without a word. Inside the pouch were silver dollars enough to buy passage back east or start fresh somewhere else. Clara stared at the money, then at the door through which the silent man had departed. For the first time since arriving in Cold Creek, she felt something other than despair. Perhaps she had traveled all this way not for Samuel Dawson, but for something else entirely. Something that began with a coat in the darkness and a stranger's inexplicable kindness. Jonas Whitlow returned at dawn the next morning, moving with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to solitude. He didn't knock, simply left another bundle on the doorstep and turned to leave. But Clara was ready this time, having barely slept, her ears attuned to every sound outside her small space. "Wait," she called, stepping into the cold morning air, still wearing his coat over her nightdress. "Please." He stopped but didn't turn around. Clara could see the tension in his broad shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the food, the money, the coat, but I can't accept charity. I need to earn my way." Jonas finally turned. In the pale morning light, she could see him more clearly, the premature silver threading through his dark hair, the lines etched deep around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if ready to bolt at any moment. He studied her face for a long moment, then gave a single nod and walked away. Clara thought that was the end of it, but he returned every morning for a week, each time. He left provisions, practical things like candles, matches, a bar of lye soap, wool stockings. Each time, Clara tried to speak with him, to offer payment or services in return. Each time, he remained silent, acknowledging her only with that same solemn nod. Martha watched these exchanges with knowing eyes. "That man hasn't done this much talking in years," she said one evening, setting down a bowl of thin stew in front of Clara. "He doesn't talk at all." Clara protested. "Child, there's more than one way to speak. Jonas Whitlow is fairly shouting, for those who know how to listen." Clara's health, already fragile from the long journey and emotional strain, began to fail. The drafty closet under the stairs offered little protection from the Montana cold, and her thin blood, accustomed to milder eastern winters, struggled to adapt. First came the cough, then the fever, then the bone-deep chills that left her shaking under every blanket Martha could spare. On the third night of her illness, as snow began to fall in earnest, Clara dreamed of home, not the boarding houses and kitchens where she'd labored, but the home she'd imagined as a child, a warm place with steady walls and someone who looked at her with kind eyes. She woke to find herself moving, cradled against a chest solid as a tree trunk. Jonas carried her through the swirling snow as if she weighed nothing, his stride never faltering despite the treacherous ground. Clara tried to protest, but her voice came out as barely a whisper against the wind. "Hush," he said, the first word she'd heard from him, rough with disuse but gentle. His cabin sat deep in the pine forest, a full hour's ride from town by wagon. Though Jonas had made it on foot while carrying her, it was modest but sturdy, built with logs so tightly fitted that no wind could find its way through. Inside, warmth hit her like a blessing. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the air smelled of cedar and coffee. Jonas laid her carefully on a bed piled high with furs and quilts, then set about making her comfortable with an efficiency that spoke of practice. He brought water, helped her sip it slowly, then disappeared into what must have been a small kitchen. Through her fevered haze, Clara observed the cabin. Everything was handmade but crafted with remarkable skill, the furniture carved with simple elegance, the floors worn smooth from years of footsteps. Books lined one wall. Surprising her, a guitar hung in the corner, its wood gleaming with care despite a layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been touched in years. Jonas returned with a bowl of broth and bread. He sat on a stool beside the bed, patient as she struggled to eat. Up close, she could see the pain that lived behind his eyes, not physical, though she noticed how he favored his left shoulder, but something deeper. For 3 days, Jonas tended to her. He was methodical in his care, keeping the fire constant, preparing simple meals, helping her to the privy when necessary with a matter-of-fact kindness that preserved her dignity. He slept on the floor by the fire, though Clara tried to insist he take the bed. On the 4th day, when her fever broke, Clara found him outside chopping wood despite the steady snow. She wrapped herself in a quilt and watched from the doorway. Each swing of the axe seemed to pain him, and she noticed how he paused frequently to roll his shoulder. "You're hurt," she said when he finally noticed her. He shrugged, then winced at the movement. "Old injury," she guessed. A nod. "I could help. My mother was a healer, taught me about liniments and poultices before she died." Jonas considered this, then gestured toward the kitchen. Clara found his meager supplies and set about making a simple remedy from pine needles and bear grease she found in a jar. When she returned, he sat stiffly on a chair, allowing her to work the mixture into his shoulder through his shirt. His muscles were knotted like ship's rope, testament to years of hard labor and poor care. Clara worked in silence, feeling him gradually relax under her hands. When she finished, he caught her wrist, not roughly, but with infinite care. "Thank you," he said, the words seeming to cost him that night. Clara insisted on cooking supper. She made a simple stew from the venison and root vegetables he had stored, seasoning it with wild herbs she found dried in bundles. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them. After dinner, Clara's eyes kept drifting to the guitar. Finally, Jonas noticed. He hesitated, then took it down, running his fingers over the strings to test their tune. The notes that emerged were sweeter than she expected, filling the small cabin with warmth beyond what the fire provided. He played without singing, a melody that spoke of loneliness and loss, of wide-open spaces and dreams deferred. Clara found tears on her cheeks without knowing why. When he finished, she reached across the small space between them and touched his hand. That was beautiful. Jonas looked at their joined hands as if seeing something impossible. Then, carefully, as if she might shatter, he turned his palm up to interlace their fingers. They stayed that way for a long moment, the fire burning low, the snow falling steadily outside. Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of bands she hadn't known were there. This man who spoke in actions rather than words, who had plucked her from certain death and asked nothing in return, who played music that made her soul ache. He was nothing like what she had expected to find in Montana. "I should go back to town tomorrow," she said eventually, though the words tasted like ash. "I have imposed enough." Jonas's grip tightened fractionally. He shook his head, then seemed to gather himself for the effort of speech. "Storm's coming," he said. "Big one. You'd never make it." Clara looked toward the window, where the snow continued to fall steadily. She knew he was right, could feel the gathering intensity in the air, but she also sensed he would have found another reason if the weather had been clear. "All right," she said softly, "until the storm passes." Jonas released her hand to tend the fire, building it up for the night. As Clara settled into the bed that smelled of pine boughs and safety, she watched him arrange his bedroll by the hearth. His movements were careful, deliberate, a man who had learned to be self-sufficient in all things. Just before she drifted off to sleep, she heard him speak again, so quietly she might have imagined it. "Stay as long as you need." In her half-dream state, Clara wondered if he meant until the storm passed, or something else entirely. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside the cabin, wrapped in fur and warmth and the strange comfort of Jonas Whitlow's presence, Clara felt safer than she had in years. Perhaps Martha had been right. Perhaps Jonas had been speaking all along, in the language of kindness and protection, in the shelter of his presence and the gift of his silence. And perhaps, Clara thought as sleep finally claimed her, she was beginning to understand how to listen. The storm passed after 3 days, leaving the world transformed beneath a blanket of pristine white. Clara stood at the cabin window, watching Jonas break a path to the barn where his horses waited. She had already made breakfast, biscuits and gravy, using supplies she'd found in his meager pantry, and the domestic normalcy of it made her chest tight with unnamed longing. When Jonas returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found her washing dishes with water she'd heated on the stove. He paused in the doorway, and she caught a flicker of something vulnerable in his expression before he schooled it back to careful neutrality. "The road to town is clear enough," he said, each word deliberate. "If you're wanting to go." Clara's hands stilled in the soapy water. During the storm, they had developed a rhythm. She cooked and mended while he tended the animals and kept the firewood stocked. Evenings were spent by the fire, him carving small figures from pine while she read aloud from one of his books. It was the closest thing to peace either had known in years. "I suppose I should," she said slowly, though her heart rebelled at the words. "Martha will wonder what became of me." Jonas nodded, but made no move to prepare the wagon. Instead, he crossed to a cupboard and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a pair of sturdy boots, fur-lined and exactly her size. "Can't walk in snow with those eastern shoes," he said gruffly. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "How did you know my size?" A slight color touched his weathered cheeks. "Noticed." She stayed another week, then another. Each time she mentioned leaving, Jonas found a reason she should wait. Ice on the paths, a horse with a thrown shoe, repairs needed on the wagon wheel. Clara knew they were excuses, just as she knew her own half-hearted protests were merely for form's sake. She began to learn the rhythms of his life. Jonas rose before dawn to tend the horses and chickens, returning with eggs and fresh milk from the goat. He worked leather in the evenings, crafting harnesses and saddles with the same careful precision he brought to everything. Clara discovered he traded these goods in town for supplies, preferring barter to currency whenever possible. "Why don't you speak in town?" she asked one evening as she watched him tool an intricate pattern into a saddle skirt. His hands paused. "Nothing to say," he answered finally. "Words get twisted. Actions don't lie." Clara thought of all the words Samuel Dawson had written, promises that had evaporated like morning mist. Then she thought of Jonas's silence, and all the ways he had spoken without uttering a sound. She began taking on more responsibilities around the cabin, the garden plot behind the house, dormant under snow. would need planning for spring. She mended his clothes, finding them well made but bearing the clumsy repairs of a man unaccustomed to needlework. She organized his pantry, preserved the last of the autumn vegetables, and even convinced him to let her trim his hair. Getting shaggy as a mountain bear, she teased, and was rewarded with one of his rare, almost smiles. The day she discovered the guitar's history was the day something fundamental shifted between them. She had been cleaning, moving furniture to sweep beneath, when she found a small leather journal that had fallen behind the bookshelf. The first entry was dated 6 years prior, written in a feminine hand. Jonas played at the church social tonight, the way his fingers move over those strings. I've never heard anything so beautiful. If only he knew how many of us ladies watch him when he plays. Clara's hands trembled as she read further, watching another woman's love turn to dissatisfaction, then resentment, then betrayal. The final entry was brief. Thomas promises to take me to San Francisco. I was meant for more than this mountain and a man who speaks more to his horses than to me. I'm taking what money we have. Jonas will understand. He always does. She was still holding the journal when Jonas returned from hunting, a brace of rabbits over his shoulder. He saw what she held and went very still. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. It fell, and Rebecca, he said, the name rough as sandpaper. My wife, former wife. He set down the rabbits and moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames. Married her when we were both 19. She liked that I was quiet then. Said still waters run deep. A bitter sound that might have been a laugh. Turns out she preferred shallow creeks that babbled pretty. Clara carefully placed the journal on the table and moved to stand beside him. She was a fool. Jonas glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. She wanted conversation, parties, life in town with folks who could give her clever words and fancy things. And you gave her your heart instead. Clara said softly, your protection, your loyalty, your music. Like I said, she was a fool. That night, Jonas played again. This time, Clara recognized the melody as a hymn her mother had sung years ago. She found herself humming along, then singing softly. Jonas's fingers never faltered, but she felt him listening with his whole being. When the song ended, he set the guitar aside and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You have a beautiful voice, he said. You have beautiful hands. She replied without thinking, then blushed furiously. Jonas looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, the hands of a working man. Then, moving with deliberate care, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, rough and warm. Clara, he said, her name a question and a prayer. She turned her face into his palm, pressing a kiss to the center. I'm not her. Jonas, I don't need words. I just need truth. He drew her close then, folding her into an embrace that felt like coming home. Clara pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and pine that had come to mean safety. His heart beat strong and steady beneath her cheek. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other in the firelight while outside the winter wind sang through the trees. When they finally drew apart, Jonas cupped her face in both hands. Stay, he said simply. Yes, she answered, just as simply. The next morning brought clear skies and a trip to town for supplies. Jonas helped Clara onto the wagon seat, then surprised her by climbing up beside her rather than walking alongside as she'd expected. Figured you might get cold, he said, arranging a buffalo robe over their laps. The journey took 2 hours through the snow-laden forest. Jonas pointed out landmarks along the way, the lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point, the creek where he watered the horses in summer, the meadow where wildflowers would bloom come June. Clara listened with growing wonder, realizing he was sharing his world with her, making it theirs. As they approached Cold Creek, Clara felt her shoulders tense. The memory of her humiliation was still fresh, the mocking voices clear in her mind. Jonas must have sensed her discomfort, for he reached over and took her gloved hand in his. Head high, he murmured. You belong here now. The townspeople certainly stared as the wagon rolled down Main Street. Jonas Whitlow, who hadn't brought anyone to town in 6 years, sitting bold as brass with the rejected mail-order bride beside him. Clara kept her eyes forward, drawing strength from Jonas's steady presence. At the general store, Jonas helped her down, keeping her hand in his as they entered. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor's wife, gaped openly. "Miss Evans," she said, recovering herself. "We thought you'd left town." "Mrs. Henderson," Clara replied with polite coolness. "I've been recovering from illness at Mr. Whitlow's cabin. He was kind enough to offer shelter during the storm." The woman's eyes darted between them, clearly burning with curiosity. Jonas stepped forward, placing their order with more words than anyone had heard from him in years. His message was clear. Clara was under his protection, and anyone who showed her disrespect would answer to him. As they loaded supplies, Samuel Dawson emerged from the bank across the street. He stopped short at the sight of them, his face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and something that might have been regret. Clara felt Jonas stiffen beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. "Mr. Dawson," she said pleasantly, as if greeting any casual acquaintance. Samuel's gaze lingered on her healthier complexion, the fine wool coat Jonas had given her, the protective way Jonas stood at her shoulder. "Miss Evans, you're looking, well, very well, thank you. The mountain air agrees with me." They left him standing there, mouth slightly open, as Jonas helped her back onto the wagon. As they rolled out of town, Clara couldn't suppress a small, satisfied smile. "Happy?" Jonas asked, and she could hear the amusement in his voice. "Exceedingly," she replied, linking her arm through his. "Now, let's go home." The word slipped out naturally, but she felt Jonas's quick intake of breath. Home, not his cabin, but theirs. The place where she belonged, with this quiet man who spoke volumes in his silences and held her with hands that knew both strength and gentleness. As the wagon climbed back into the mountains, Clara began to hum again, a new melody this time, one that seemed to rise from her heart without conscious thought. Jonas listened, then began to whistle a harmony, and together they made music that echoed through the pines, announcing to the world that Clara Evans had found where she belonged at last. The morning dawned crisp and clear, perfect for gathering mushrooms in the forest. Clara had discovered Jonas's knowledge of edible plants rivaled that of any herbalist, and she'd begged him to teach her. They set out with woven baskets, Clara wearing the sturdy boots he'd given her and a wool cloak that had appeared one day without explanation. "Never pick near the oak roots," Jonas instructed, showing her the difference between false morals and true ones. "And these here," he pointed to a cluster of orange caps, "beautiful but deadly. Nature's warning colors." They worked their way deeper into the woods, filling their baskets with chanterelles and oyster mushrooms. Clara found herself stealing glances at Jonas as he moved through the forest with the quiet grace of a man completely at home in the wilderness. When he caught her looking, a faint smile touched his lips. "What?" he asked, that single word holding volumes of affection. "Nothing," she said, warmth blooming in her chest. "Just thinking how different this is from Philadelphia." The sky, which had been clear an hour before, began to darken with alarming speed. Jonas looked up, reading signs in the clouds that Clara couldn't decipher. "Storm coming," he said, urgency threading through his voice. "Fast one. We need shelter." The temperature plummeted as if nature had opened a door to winter's heart. Snow began falling in thick, heavy flakes that quickly obscured their path. Jonas took Clara's hand, leading her with sure steps even as visibility dropped to mere feet. "There's a cave," he said over the rising wind. "Not far." By the time they reached it, Clara was shivering violently despite her warm clothes. The cave was little more than a hollow in the rock face, but it cut the wind and provided cover from the snow. Jonas immediately set about gathering what dry wood he could find near the entrance, managing to start a small fire with the matches he always carried. "We'll have to wait it out," he said, arranging their cloaks to create a barrier against the cold stone. Could be hours. Clara nodded, her teeth chattering too hard for speech. Jonas studied her with concern, then opened his coat. Come here, he said softly. She hesitated only a moment before moving into the shelter of his arms. He wrapped the coat around both of them, her back pressed against his chest, his arms encircling her. The shared warmth was immediate and overwhelming, not just the physical heat, but the intimacy of it. Better? His breath stirred her hair. Yes, she whispered. They sat in silence, watching the snow fall beyond their small circle of firelight. Clara became intensely aware of every point of contact, his heartbeat against her back, his arms strong and steady around her, the way his chin rested lightly on top of her head. She felt him shift slightly, his hold tightening as if he'd made some internal decision. Clara, he said, her name a rumble she felt as much as heard. I need to tell you something. She waited, not moving, sensing the importance of this moment. When Rebecca left, I thought it was proof I wasn't meant for connection, that some men are built for solitude. He paused, gathering words like he gathered kindling, carefully, deliberately. Told myself I was better alone, safer, can't disappoint someone who isn't there. Clara turned slightly in his arms, just enough to see his profile limned by firelight. Jonas, then you arrived. He continued, the words flowing more freely now, as if a dam had cracked. Thrown away like you were nothing. But I saw you standing on that platform, chin up despite everything. And I recognized something, the way a person holds themselves when they're determined not to break. His hand moved to stroke her hair, the gesture infinitely gentle. I told myself I was just being neighborly, Christian charity. But that was a lie. Truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about you. The way you tried to smile at those fools. The way you sat on that cot in Martha's back room like a queen in exile. Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they weren't from sadness. No one had ever seen her so clearly, valued her so deeply. You saved me, she whispered. No, Jonas said firmly. We saved each other. He turned her in his arms then, so they faced each other in the flickering light. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs gently brushing away her tears. Clara had never seen such naked emotion in his eyes, want and fear and hope all tangled together. I'm not good with words, he said. Don't know how to say pretty things like educated men, but I need you to know. Clara, you've brought light back into my life, made me remember why music sounds sweet and food tastes good and mornings are worth seeing. Clara couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. Instead, she reached up and placed her hands over his, holding them against her face. I don't need pretty words, she managed. I just need you. The kiss happened slowly, inevitably, like spring following winter. Jonas's lips were warm and slightly chapped, moving over hers with careful reverence. Clara had been kissed before, fumbling attempts by boys back east who'd seen her as easy prey for a servant girl. But this was different. This was Jonas laying his heart bare, offering everything he was without reservation. When they drew apart, both breathing unsteadily, Clara saw wonder in his eyes. She touched his face, marveling at the contrast of rough stubble and soft skin, strength and vulnerability. I never expected this, Jonas said. Never thought I'd feel whole again. They held each other as the storm raged outside, sharing warmth and stolen kisses and whispered confessions. Jonas told her about his childhood, his parents' farm lost to drought, drifting until he'd saved enough to claim this piece of mountain. Clara spoke of her mother's death, the uncle who'd sold her into service, the years of invisibility in other people's homes. No more, Jonas said fiercely. You're not invisible, not to me, never to me. The storm began to ease as darkness fell. They dozed fitfully, wrapped in each other's arms, waking periodically to tend the dying fire. When dawn broke, painting the snow-covered world in shades of rose and gold. They emerged from the cave transformed. Jonas helped Clara navigate the deep drifts, his hand never leaving hers. When they reached a small clearing, he stopped suddenly, bending to brush snow from a cluster of hardy wildflowers that had somehow survived beneath the white blanket. "Mountain candy tuft," he said, carefully extracting a single bloom. "Toughest flower there is. Blooms through snow, through drought, through everything nature throws at it." He tucked the delicate white flower behind Clara's ear, his fingers lingering against her temple. "Like you," he said simply. Clara stood on her tiptoes and kissed him there in the morning light, tasting promise and commitment and the end of loneliness for them both. The journey back to the cabin took longer than usual, the snow making every step an effort. But Clara felt she could have walked forever with Jonas's hand in hers, their new understanding warming her more thoroughly than any fire. When the cabin finally came into view, smoke still trickling from the chimney they'd banked the day before, Clara felt a surge of homecoming so powerful it weakened her knees. "All right?" Jonas asked, immediately concerned. "Perfect," she assured him. "Everything is perfect." That evening, as Clara prepared supper and Jonas repaired a harness by the fire, she found herself humming again. The melody was different now, richer, more complex, with undertones of joy she'd never thought to feel. When Jonas looked up and smiled at her, that rare, transformative smile that changed his entire face, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Outside, the mountain settled under its blanket of snow, and somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, not mournful, but triumphant, calling to its mate across the miles. Jonas rose and crossed to Clara, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she stirred the pot. "No more running," he murmured against her hair. "No more hiding. This is real. Clara, you and me." She leaned back into his solid warmth, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Real," she agreed. "And forever." The word hung between them, precious and fragile as the mountain flower in her hair. Jonas turned her to face him, and in his eyes, she saw her future written plain. Not the future she'd imagined as a desperate woman answering an advertisement, but something infinitely better, a life built on truth and tenderness, on shared silences and perfect understanding. "Forever," Jonas repeated, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and home, and all the words he'd never need to say. The whispers started in town like wildfire in dry grass. Jonas Whitlow, the hermit of the mountain, had taken in the rejected mail-order bride. Some said it was Christian charity. Others suggested darker motives. But when weeks turned to months and Clara remained at the cabin, the gossip turned ugly. Clara first noticed the change during a supply run. Women who had merely ignored her before now actively turned their backs. Men's gazes lingered too long, their smirks speaking volumes about what they assumed. Living in sin. She heard Mrs. Dawson say loudly as she passed. "Bold as brass about it, too." Jonas, loading sacks of flour, went rigid. Clara placed a warning hand on his arm, feeling the tension coiled beneath. "It doesn't matter," she murmured. But it did matter when the shopkeeper charged them double for goods. It mattered when the blacksmith refused to shoe Jonas's horses. It mattered when someone left a crude message painted on their wagon. The confrontation came on a March afternoon when the snow was melting and tempers ran as high as the spring rivers. 3 men rode up to the cabin: Tom Brennan, Luke Morrison, and Samuel Dawson himself. Jonas was splitting wood. Clara was hanging laundry. The sight of her doing such domestic tasks seemed to inflame them further. "Whitlow!" Brennan called out, dismounting with the swagger of a man looking for trouble. "Need to have words with you." Jonas embedded the axe in the chopping block and turned, positioning himself between the men and Clara. "Speak your piece. You're making the whole town look bad," Morrison said, spitting tobacco juice. "Keeping a woman up here without marriage, it ain't decent." "Man's got a right to take in strays," Samuel added with a nasty smile. "Though most folks have the sense to keep them in the barn, not the house." Clara felt heat flood her face. But before she could respond, Jonas moved. Not quickly, but with the deliberate purpose of an avalanche. He grabbed Samuel by the shirt front and lifted him clean off his feet. "Apologize," Jonas said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." "For speaking truth," Samuel gasped. "Everyone knows what she is. What kind of woman travels across the country to marry a stranger? What kind lives with a man unwed?" Jonas drew back his fist, but Clara's voice cut through the tension. "The kind who works for her keep," she said clearly, stepping forward. "The kind who cooks and mends and tends house in exchange for shelter. Or is Christian charity only acceptable when it doesn't threaten your narrow minds?" Brennan laughed unpleasantly. "Christian charity? That what you're calling it?" The sound of Jonas's fist connecting with Brennan's jaw was like a gunshot. The man went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. Morrison reached for his pistol, but Jonas was already moving, the months of silence exploding into violent action. "Stop!" Clara threw herself between them. "Jonas, please!" He caught himself mid-swing, chest heaving, knuckles already blooming with bruises. Clara pressed her hands against his chest, feeling his heart race beneath her palms. "They're not worth it," she said urgently. "Please, for me." Jonas's eyes, wild with rage, slowly focused on her face. The fight went out of him gradually, replaced by something that might have been shame. He stepped back, helping Brennan to his feet with rough efficiency. "Get off my land," he said. "Don't come back." Samuel, still rubbing his throat, sneered. "This isn't over. Whitlow, town's got laws about moral behavior. Sheriff might have something to say about your charity." They rode away, leaving threats hanging in the air like smoke. Clara began to shake, reaction setting in. Jonas immediately pulled her into his arms. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "Shouldn't have lost control. It's just hearing them talk about you like that." "I know." Clara held him tightly, feeling the tremors running through his solid frame. But violence won't change their minds. That night, as Clara tended his bruised hands, Jonas was quieter than usual. She could see him wrestling with something, the way his jaw worked and his eyes avoided hers. "Say it," she said finally. He sighed. "They're not entirely wrong. About appearances, about what people think. And I don't care what they think. But you deserve better than their scorn. Deserve to walk through town with your head high without anyone daring to whisper." Clara set aside the cloth and cupped his face in her hands. "Jonas Whitlow, are you trying to propose?" Color flooded his cheeks. That's not, not like this. You deserve better than a proposal born from other men's ugly words." "I deserve the truth," Clara countered. "Do you want to marry me because of what they said? Or because of what's in your heart?" Jonas caught her hands, pressing kisses to each palm. Been thinking about it for weeks, months, maybe since that night in the cave. But I wanted to do it right. Courting and flowers and all the things a lady should have. I'm not a lady," Clara said softly. "I'm just a woman who loves a good man and wants to build a life with him." "You love me?" The wonder in his voice nearly broke her heart. "With everything I have," she confirmed. "Though heaven knows why. You stubborn, silent, wonderful fool." Jonas pulled her onto his lap, burying his face in her hair. "Marry me," he said, the words muffled but fervent. "Not because of them, because I can't imagine another day without you as my wife, because you've made me whole again, because I love you more than I have words to say." "Yes," Clara said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her then, pouring all his love and promise and devotion into the connection. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Jonas reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made Clara gasp. It was a ring, carved from pine wood with infinite care. The band was smooth as silk, inlaid with a design of mountain flowers and vines. It must have taken hours of painstaking work. "Been carrying it for 2 weeks," he admitted. "Waiting for the right moment." Clara held out her hand, watching through tears as he slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm and solid and uniquely theirs. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Temporary," Jonas corrected. "When we go to Bozeman for supplies, we'll get you a proper gold band." "No." Clara shook her head firmly. "This is perfect, made by your hands, from the wood of our mountain. I wouldn't trade it for all the gold in California." They were married a week later in their own clearing, with the mountains as witness and old Martha from town as their only guest. The preacher had refused to come, but Martha knew the words and spoke them with quiet authority. Clara wore a simple dress she'd made from fabric Jonas had bought in secret, embroidered with the same mountain flowers he'd carved on her ring. Jonas wore his best shirt and a look of such profound joy that Martha wept openly. "Do you, Jonas Matthew Whitlow, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." The words came strong and sure, ringing through the forest. "Do you, Clara Marie Evans, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Clara's voice trembled with emotion, but her gaze never wavered from Jonas's face. "Then, by the power vested in me, by the territory of Montana and the Lord above, I pronounce you husband and wife." Jonas cradled Clara's face in his hands and kissed her with aching tenderness. Above them, an eagle cried out, circling the clearing as if in benediction. Martha clapped and threw dried flowers she'd saved from summer. That night, in their cabin, truly theirs now in every sense, Jonas and Clara came together as husband and wife. He was gentle and reverent, worshipping her with hands that trembled despite their strength. Clara gave herself completely, holding nothing back, showing him with her body what words could never fully express. Afterward, they lay entwined, watching firelight dance on the walls. Jonas traced lazy patterns on Clara's bare shoulder, marveling at the silk of her skin. "My wife," he said, testing the words. "My husband," she replied, pressing a kiss to his chest. "They'll talk more now," Jonas warned. "Townfolk don't like being defied. Let them talk." Clara stretched like a contented cat. "We have everything we need right here." Jonas pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Everything," he agreed. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside their cabin, warmth reigned supreme. They had built something stronger than gossip, deeper than prejudice, a love that could weather any storm the world might send. And in the morning, when Clara woke to find Jonas watching her with wondering eyes, she knew that this quiet joy, this perfect understanding, this love that needed no words, was worth every whispered slight and harsh judgment the town could muster. "Good morning, husband," she murmured. "Good morning, wife," he replied, and kissed her into the new day. Spring arrived with a rush of snowmelt and wildflowers, transforming the mountain into a paradise of color and life. Clara threw herself into creating a proper home, planting a vegetable garden behind the cabin and learning the rhythms of farm life. Jonas taught her to milk the goat, gather eggs without frightening the hens, and read the weather in cloud formations. She discovered an old churn in the barn and began making butter, delighting in the simple alchemy of cream becoming something useful. Jonas built her better shelves for preserving, and she filled them with jams from wild berries and pickled vegetables for the winter ahead. "You're becoming a proper mountain woman," Jonas said one morning, finding her elbow deep in bread dough, flour dusting her nose. "Is that approval I hear, Mr. Whitlow?" she teased. He crossed the kitchen and kissed the flour from her nose. Complete and absolute. Their days developed a comfortable pattern. Jonas worked the horses and maintained the property, while Clara managed the household and learned skills she'd never needed as a servant. In the evenings, they sat together, she with her mending, he with his leather work, comfortable in their shared silence. The dress came about almost by accident. Jonas had traded a saddle for supplies and returned with a length of blue calico. "Thought you might like something new," he said, unusually shy. "Something not made from flour sacks and patches." Clara fingered the fabric, simple but pretty, the color of summer sky. "It's beautiful, But Jonas, the expense— My wife deserves a dress that fits proper, he said firmly. Besides, winter was good for pelts. We can afford it. Clara worked on the dress in secret, wanting to surprise him, but her skills with a needle, while adequate for mending, weren't quite up to dressmaking. The sleeves came out crooked, the hem uneven. She was near tears when Jonas found her, surrounded by fabric scraps and failed attempts. Here, he said quietly, kneeling beside her. Let me. To her amazement, his large hands managed the fine work with unexpected skill. He showed her how to set a sleeve properly, his movements sure and practiced. How do you know this? Clara asked, watching him work. Ma was a seamstress before she married Pa, he said, not looking up from his stitching. Used to help her when I was young. Hands weren't so big then. Together they finished the dress, Clara cutting and pinning, Jonas handling the trickier seams. When she tried it on, it fit like it was made for her, which of course it was. Beautiful, Jonas said, but his eyes never left her face. The winter festival arrived with December snows. Clara had been apprehensive about attending, remembering their last venture into town. But Jonas was determined. We're married now, he said. Legal and proper. They can gossip all they want, but they can't deny facts. Clara wore her blue dress with her mother's cameo at her throat, one of the few things she'd brought from Philadelphia. Jonas wore his wedding shirt and a determined expression that dared anyone to cause trouble. The town hall was decorated with pine boughs and candles, filled with the sounds of fiddle music and laughter. Conversation stuttered to a halt when they entered, a ripple of whispers following their progress. Jonas's hand tightened on Clara's elbow. Steady, he murmured. We belong here much as anyone. Martha hurried over, beaming. Clara, Jonas, don't you both look fine? Come, there's cider and dancing. Having Martha's obvious approval helped. Others began to nod acknowledgement, if not exactly welcome. When Jonas led Clara onto the dance floor for a reel, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes. Let them look, Jonas said, leading her through the steps with surprising grace. My wife is the prettiest woman here. Clara laughed, letting him spin her until her skirts flared. When the music slowed to a waltz, Jonas pulled her closer than was strictly proper, and she didn't protest. Where did you learn to dance? She asked, following his lead effortlessly. Same as sewing. Ma insisted her boys would be gentlemen, even on the frontier. She succeeded, Clara said softly. They were taking a break, Jonas fetching her punch, when trouble found them, Mrs. Brennan, still bitter about her husband's bloodied nose, made a point of speaking just loudly enough to be overheard. Some women have no shame, she said to her circle. Trapping a man with their wiles. Everyone knows what kind of woman answers those advertisements. Clara's cheeks burned, but before she could respond, another voice cut through. And everyone knows what kind of woman spreads poison with her tongue. It was Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, Luke Morrison's own mother, a pillar of the church and community. She moved to stand beside Clara, her presence commanding respect. I've watched Jonas Whitlow these past months, Adelaide continued, addressing the room at large. Seen him smile for the first time in 6 years. Seen him come to town regular instead of hiding on his mountain. That's what a good woman does for a man. Brings out his best. She turned to Clara. My dear, I owe you an apology for not speaking sooner. Welcome to Cold Creek. The tide turned with Adelaide's words. Others approached throughout the evening, tentative at first, then warmer. The banker's wife complimented Clara's dress and asked about her garden. The schoolteacher inquired if Clara might help with the Christmas pageant. When they finally left, Clara's head spun from the sudden acceptance. Jonas helped her into the wagon, then surprised her by pulling her close for a kiss right there on Main Street. What was that for? She asked, breathless. For being brave, for standing tall, for being my wife. The ride home through the snowy forest was magical. Jonas had hung lanterns on the wagon, and their light caught the falling snow like fairy dust. Clara snuggled against her husband's side, wondering if happiness could truly be this simple. Back at the cabin, Jonas built up the fire while Clara made coffee. When she turned from the stove, she found him holding a package wrapped in brown paper. "Christmas is 2 weeks away," she protested. This couldn't wait. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with the string. Inside was a shawl of the softest wool Clara had ever touched, dyed a deep forest green and fringed with careful knots. The work was exquisite, clearly professional. "Jonas, it's beautiful, but the cost—" "Didn't cost money," he interrupted. "Traded for it. Man passing through, heading to California. His wife made it, but she—" He trailed off uncomfortably. "She died on the trail. He couldn't bear keeping her things." Clara held the shawl reverently, thinking of another woman's hands creating this beauty, never knowing it would warm a stranger. "I'll treasure it," she said solemnly. "There's more," Jonas said, producing a smaller package. Inside was a silver thimble engraved with tiny flowers and the initials C.W. "Clara Whitlow," she read, tears starting. "Oh, Jonas. Wanted you to have something fine, something that shows you're a lady, no matter what anyone says." Clara set aside the gifts and moved into his arms. "I don't need fine things. I just need you." "You have me," he said roughly. "Always." That night, as snow continued to fall and their fire burned low, Jonas played his guitar while Clara sang carols her mother had taught her. Her voice rose clear and true in the winter air, weaving around his melody like their lives had woven together, separate threads becoming something stronger, something whole. When the last note faded, Jonas set aside the guitar and drew her onto his lap. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. "Peace, contentment, joy." "Again?" Clara asked gently. Jonas was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Had it once with Rebecca, or thought I did. But it was like a coat that didn't quite fit, looked right from the outside, but always pinched and pulled. This, with you. This is different. This is coming home." Clara kissed him softly, tasting honesty and commitment on his lips. "Home," she agreed. "Forever home." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain in pristine white, but inside the cabin, warmed by fire and love and the promise of all their tomorrows, Clara and Jonas held each other close and knew that they had found something rare and precious, a love that had transformed them both, turning loneliness into belonging, silence into song. Spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal, and Clara noticed the familiar signs her mother had once described: morning queasiness, bone-deep fatigue, and a tenderness that made even her loosest dress uncomfortable. She kept the knowledge to herself for 2 weeks, wanting to be certain, treasuring the secret like a pearl held close to her heart. When she finally told Jonas, he was repairing the chicken coop, his shirt sleeves rolled up in the warm April sun. She approached quietly, watching him work, loving the competent movement of his hands. "Jonas," she said softly. He turned, immediately alert to something in her tone. "What is it? Are you well?" "Very well," she assured him, taking his hands in hers. "Jonas, we're going to have a baby." The hammer slipped from his fingers, clattering on the ground. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, then a fear so profound it took her breath away. "A baby," he repeated, as if the words were foreign. "By November, I think," Clara said, concerned by his pallor. "Jonas, I thought you'd be happy." "I am," he said quickly, pulling her into his arms, but she could feel him trembling. "I am. It's just—" She pulled back to study his face. "Tell me." Jonas sank onto a tree stump, pulling her down beside him. "Rebecca was with child when she left," he said quietly. "Our baby. She went to one of those women in town, got rid of it before running off with Thomas, said she couldn't start a new life with my child weighing her down." Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. In all their months together, he'd never shared this particular pain. Now she understood the depth of fear in his eyes. "I'm not her," Clara said fiercely, gripping his face between her hands. "This baby is wanted. loved already. You hear me, Jonas Whitlow? This child is a blessing." He searched her eyes, then crushed her against him, his face buried in her hair. "I can't lose you," he said, voice muffled and raw. "Either of you, I can't survive it again." "You won't lose us," Clara promised. "We're strong, the baby and I, mountain strong, like those flowers you showed me." Jonas drew back, touching her still flat stomach with reverent fingers. "Our child," he said wonderingly. "Ours. Ours," Clara confirmed, covering his hand with hers. As spring turned to summer, Jonas's protectiveness intensified. He forbade her from lifting anything heavier than a soup pot, took over the garden work, and watched her with worried eyes whenever she showed the slightest fatigue. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Clara said in exasperation one July morning when he tried to prevent her from gathering eggs. "Humor me," Jonas replied, his jaw set in the stubborn line she knew meant no arguing. Clara found unexpected allies in town. Mrs. Morrison Adelaide became a regular visitor, bringing advice and baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Even Mrs. Henderson at the general store softened, recommending remedies for morning sickness and sharing stories of her own pregnancies. "Babies have a way of healing communities," Adelaide said during one visit, watching Clara work on tiny clothes. "New life makes people remember what's important." Jonas built a cradle with the same meticulous care he brought to all his work. Clara would find him in the barn late at night, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, carving delicate roses into the headboard. "It's beautiful," she said one evening, running her hands over the craftsmanship. "Want it perfect," Jonas muttered, frowning at some imperceptible flaw. "Our child deserves perfect. Our child deserves love," Clara corrected gently. "And that, Jonas Whitlow, we have in abundance." The scare came in August, during the hottest part of summer. Clara was hanging laundry when pain lanced through her middle, sharp enough to double her over, when Jonas found her minutes later, clutching the porch rail and white as paper. His face went gray. He carried her to bed and rode hell for leather to town, returning with Dr. Hartwell. The old doctor examined Clara thoroughly while Jonas paced outside, wearing a path in the floorboards. "Baby's fine," Hartwell announced, emerging from the bedroom. "But Mrs. Whitlow needs rest. Complete rest for at least a week. The heat and overwork, her body's warning her to slow down." Jonas nearly collapsed with relief. When the doctor left, he sat beside Clara's bed, holding her hand like a lifeline. "You scared me," he said roughly. "I scared myself," Clara admitted. "But we're all right. The doctor said so. You're staying in that bed if I have to tie you to it." Jonas declared. Clara smiled weakly. "I don't think that will be necessary. But Jonas, the garden, the preserving, will keep or won't. I don't care about anything but you and this baby." He was true to his word, taking over all household duties with grim determination. His cooking was basic but filling, and if the floors weren't swept quite as clean or the wash not quite as white, neither of them minded. The fire came without warning on a September night when the world was tinder dry from the late summer heat. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and Jonas shaking her urgently. "Fire's coming down the mountain," he said tersely. "We need to leave, now." But Jonas was already looking toward the barn. "The horses," he said, anguish in his voice. The animals were their livelihood, their future. "Go," Clara said, pushing him toward the door. "I'll gather what I can." "Clara, no, go! I'll be right behind you." He went, and Clara moved as quickly as her swollen body allowed, throwing precious items into a sack. The money tin, Jonas's mother's Bible, the wooden ring he'd carved for her. Smoke was thickening when she reached the door. She could see Jonas in the barn, fighting to free the panicked horses. Flames crested the ridge above them, an orange wall of destruction bearing down. Clara started across the yard, then stopped as pain rippled through her. Not labor, not yet, but warning. "Jonas!" she screamed above the roar of fire. He turned, saw her frozen in the yard. and abandoned the horses without hesitation. He reached her just as her knees buckled, scooping her up and running for the creek. Behind them, she heard the horses scream as Jonas had taught them to, and they bolted free from the barn. They spent the night standing waist-deep in the creek pool, Clara in Jonas's arms, watching their world burn. The cabin, the barn, the garden, all consumed by flames that painted the sky hell-red. When dawn came, revealing the devastation, Jonas carried Clara to a flat rock and gently set her down. She expected despair, rage, something. Instead, he cupped her face in his soot-stained hands. "You're alive," he said simply. "The baby's safe. Nothing else matters." "But Jonas, everything we built can be built again. You can't be replaced." By mid-morning, help arrived. Adelaide Morrison led a parade of wagons filled with neighbors, men Jonas had barely spoken to, women who'd whispered about Clara. They came with water barrels and shovels, though the fire had burned itself out. "Nothing left to save," Luke Morrison said, surveying the smoldering ruins. "Everything left to save," Adelaide corrected sharply. "Jonas, Clara, you'll stay with us until you rebuild. No arguments." What followed was a week Clara would remember forever. The community that had once scorned them now embraced them fully. Men who'd mocked Jonas worked alongside him to clear the land. Women who'd gossiped about Clara brought baby clothes and preserves saved from their own cellars. "Why?" Clara asked Adelaide one evening as they watched the men raise the frame of a new cabin. "Because you're ours now," Adelaide said simply. "Both of you. Jonas was one of us all along. We just forgot, and you reminded us what it means to be neighbors." The new cabin was smaller but snugger than the old, built with community hands and blessed with more goodwill than the finest mansion. Jonas added touches everywhere that spoke of hope: an extra room for the baby, windows facing east for morning sun, a porch where Clara could sit and sew. On the last night in their new home before the baby came, Jonas played his guitar, one of the few possessions that had survived in the root cellar. Clara sang, her voice mixing with the sound of hammering as neighbors added final touches by lamplight. "We lost so much," she said when the song ended. "We gained more," Jonas countered, his hand resting on her belly. "A child coming, a community, proof that we're stronger than whatever comes." As if in agreement, the baby kicked hard against his palm. Jonas's face lit with wonder, as it did every time. "Little fighter," he murmured. "Like your mama. Like both of us," Clara corrected. "Survivors. All." That night, lying in their new bed in their new home, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here, a desperate woman fleeing poverty, a broken man hiding from pain, and somehow they'd found each other, found healing, found home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The baby would come soon. Winter would test their rebuilt life, and who knew what else awaited. But tonight, held safe in Jonas's arms while their community kept watch and their child grew strong within her, Clara knew they could weather any storm. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "Love you back," Jonas replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Both of you, always." Outside, someone started singing, a hymn of thanksgiving that others picked up, voices rising into the star-filled sky. Clara closed her eyes and listened, her heart full to bursting with gratitude for fires that cleared the way for new growth, for communities that could learn to embrace instead of reject, and for love that could transform two broken people into something whole and beautiful and enduring. The first snow of November was falling when Clara's pains began. Jonas had been watching her like a hawk for weeks, barely leaving her side, and when she gasped and clutched her belly during breakfast, his coffee cup shattered on the floor. "It's time," Clara said, trying to sound calm despite the wave of pain. Jonas was already moving, throwing on his coat. "I'll fetch Dr. Hartwell." "No." Clara caught his arm. "The snow's too deep, and these pains are just starting. Send for Adelaide instead. She's delivered more babies than the doctor anyway." Jonas looked torn between following her wishes and riding for professional help. Another contraction made the decision for him as Clara gripped his hand hard enough to leave marks. Within an hour, Adelaide Morrison arrived with her daughter Sarah and a bag full of supplies. She took one look at Clara and began issuing orders with the efficiency of a general. "Jonas, keep that water boiling. Sarah, tear these sheets into strips. Clara, breathe with me. Dear, that's it." The labor was long and difficult. All through that day and into the night, Clara struggled to bring their child into the world. Jonas never left her side, letting her crush his fingers through each contraction, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she wanted to give up. "Can't," Clara gasped after a particularly hard pain. "Too tired?" "Yes, you can," Jonas said fiercely. "You're the strongest woman I know. Our baby needs you to be strong just a little longer." Adelaide nodded approvingly. "Listen to your husband. Clara, baby's almost here." As dawn broke on the new day, painting the snow-covered mountains pink and gold, Matthew Jonas Whitlow entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes. "A son," Adelaide announced, placing the squalling bundle on Clara's chest. "Healthy and perfect." Jonas stared at the tiny form with wonder and terror in equal measure. "So small," he whispered. "How can anything be that small?" Clara, exhausted but radiant, guided his hand to touch their son's downy head. "He's perfect," she murmured. "Look, Jonas. He has your nose." "Poor kid," Jonas said, but his voice broke on the words. Adelaide and Sarah quietly cleaned up and departed, leaving the new family alone. Jonas sat on the bed beside Clara, one arm around her shoulders, the other cradling their son with infinite care. "Matthew for my father," Clara said softly. "Jonas for his." "Matthew Jonas Whitlow," Jonas repeated, testing the name. "Matt, our son." The baby opened his eyes, startling blue like a winter sky, and seemed to look directly at his father. Jonas made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your PA. I promise. I promise to keep you safe, to teach you everything I know, to love you and your mama with everything I have." The early weeks were a blur of feedings and diaper changes, of sleepless nights and quiet miracles. Jonas proved to be a devoted father, walking the floors with Matt when colic kept him crying, changing diapers without complaint, staring at his son with the same wonder he'd shown that first day. "Never thought I'd have this," he confided to Clara one night as she nursed the baby. "A family. After Rebecca, I thought that part of my life was done. God had other plans," Clara said, stroking Matt's silky hair. "Better plans," Jonas agreed, kissing her temple. Winter settled over the mountain with its usual ferocity, but the rebuilt cabin stood strong against the storms. Neighbors stopped by regularly, bringing food and company. The community that had rallied to help them rebuild continued to embrace them, and Clara often found her eyes misting at the unexpected blessings. In January, Clara received a letter that made her cry for different reasons. Her younger sister Emma, still in Philadelphia, had written to the old boarding house, and Martha had forwarded it. "Clara," she read aloud to Jonas, "I hope this finds you. I've worried so since you left. Please write and tell me you're well. I have news. I'm to be married to a good man, a baker named Samuel Reed. I wish you could be here. Your loving sister, Emma." Clara pressed the letter to her heart. "I thought I'd lost her forever." "Write back," Jonas urged. "Tell her about us. About Matt. Maybe." He hesitated, then forged ahead. "Maybe she and her husband could visit come summer, or even move out here. There's always need for a good baker in growing towns." Clara stared at him. "You do that? Invite my family?" "Your family is my family," Jonas said simply. "That's what marriage means." Clara threw her arms around him, mindful of the baby sleeping between them. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Only 12 times," Jonas said, but he was smiling. "Tell me again." Spring arrived with its usual glory, and Clara resumed her teaching work with the local children. She'd started the informal school during the winter, teaching letters and numbers to the miners' and farmers' daughters who had no other opportunity for education. The classes met in her kitchen, with Matt sleeping in his cradle nearby. Education changes everything, she told Jonas when he expressed concern about her taking on too much. These girls deserve the same chances boys get. Jonas built her a proper desk and benches, and even carved a small chalkboard. Watching Clara teach, patient and encouraging with even the slowest learners, filled him with pride. "You're making a difference," he said one evening after the children had gone home. "We're making a difference," Clara corrected. "This life we've built, it matters." "Jonas, we're showing people that second chances are real, that love can overcome prejudice, that families can be made from broken pieces." Summer brought Emma and her new husband for a visit. Clara cried when she saw her sister step down from the stage, and cried harder when Emma burst into tears at the sight of her. "You look so well," Emma said, holding Clara at arm's length. "So happy, and this must be Jonas." Jonas, holding Matt, extended his free hand awkwardly, but Emma ignored it and hugged him like a long-lost brother. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving her, for loving her." Jonas cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion. "She saved me," he said gruffly. The visit was everything Clara had dreamed. Emma fell in love with Montana and with her nephew. Samuel Reed proved to be a jovial man who got along well with Jonas, and by the week's end, they were making plans to relocate. "Cold Creek could use a bakery," Samuel said thoughtfully. "And Emma's right. This place feels like home already." On their last night, the two couples sat on the porch Jonas had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains. Matt slept in Clara's arms, making small, contented sounds. "I never imagined this," Emma said softly. "When you left, I thought I'd lost you to the wilderness, but you didn't get lost. You found yourself." "Found more than that," Clara said, looking at Jonas. "Found everything." As autumn approached with its golden light and crisp air, Clara often reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that terrified girl on the train platform to this wife, mother, teacher, respected member of the community. The transformation seemed impossible. Yet here she was. One evening, as Jonas played guitar and she sang Matt to sleep, she noticed several neighbors had gathered outside to listen. Word had spread about their informal concerts, and people often found excuses to linger nearby when music drifted from the cabin. "We should have a proper gathering," Adelaide suggested the next day. "A harvest celebration. You and Jonas could play for everyone." And so they did. On a perfect October evening, the whole community gathered at the Whitlow cabin. Tables groaned with food. Children ran between the adults' legs. And when Jonas brought out his guitar, a hush fell over the crowd. He played the old hymns and folk songs everyone knew, and Clara's voice rose clear and true above the assembly. But it was the last song that brought tears, a melody Jonas had written himself, wordless but speaking volumes about love and loss and redemption. When the last note faded, Matt, now almost a year old, clapped his chubby hands and called out, "Pa!" his first word, clear as a bell. Jonas swept his son into his arms, his eyes suspiciously bright. "That's right, little man, I'm your PA." The photograph Adelaide's husband took that night would sit on Clara's mantel for decades to come. Jonas holding Matt, Clara's hand on his shoulder, both of them smiling with the kind of joy that can't be manufactured or posed. Later, after the guests had gone home and Matt was asleep in his crib, Clara and Jonas stood together on their porch, looking out at the mountains bathed in moonlight. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked quietly. "Coming west, that awful beginning." Clara turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "How can I regret the path that led me to you? To this?" She gestured at their home, their land, their life. "Every hard step was worth it." Jonas kissed her then, pouring all his love and gratitude into the connection. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing past the silence, for teaching me to speak again, for our son, for everything." "Thank you," Clara whispered back, "for catching me when I fell, for showing me I was worth saving, for loving me exactly as I am." They stood together in the Montana moonlight, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of their former lives. Inside, their son slept peacefully, dreaming baby dreams. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows. But tonight, held safe in each other's arms with the mountains standing eternal guard around them, Clara and Jonas Whitlow were complete. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and fashioned them into something stronger than either could have imagined. A love that would endure through seasons and storms, through joy and sorrow, through all the days of their lives, and in the years to come. When their grandchildren asked how they met, Clara would smile and say, "It's a long story, but it begins with a train and ends with a home." Jonas would add, in his quiet way, "Best trade I ever made, a coat for a lifetime." Then they would look at each other with the same wonder they'd felt that first night, when kindness bridged the gap between strangers and began weaving the threads that would become there forever. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the mountains and valleys of the human heart. We hope Clara and Jonas's story touched you as much as it touched us here at Wild West Campfire. Where are you listening to this tale tonight? Drop a comment below and let us know, whether you're driving through the prairie, cozied up by your own fire, or stealing a moment of peace in your busy day. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love, courage, and redemption from the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Clara and Jonas's journey. What moment spoke most to your heart? Until next time, partners, keep those campfires burning and those hearts open to love's possibilities.